Hello, my name is Ban Chimer. I am the founder of Inyalinya Basiddet organization. Inyalinya Basiddet, it's feminist and a feminist organization focusing on domestic worker in Lebanon. Because of the coronavirus and the lockdown, many domestic workers are suffering behind closed door, and they can't even feed their kids. Because of that, we are gathering food and distributing home to home. But we want to do more, and we set up also GoFundMe accounts. If anyone is interested to donate, we'll be grateful. And you can find this link to in our Twitter at Inyalenya DWU. Thank you so much.
So this is a conversation with Julia Choucair Vizoso. She's an independent scholar trained as a political scientist as well as an editor and translator at The Public Source, which is a Beirut-based independent media organization. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative, collaborating on the program on sustainable and inclusive environmental policy in the MENA region. Now, The Public Source describes itself as such. It is dedicated to reporting on socioeconomic and environmental crises afflicting Lebanon since the onset of neoliberal governance in the 90s, and providing political commentary on events unfolding since October 17, 2019. For that reason, I wanted to talk to Julia. She's well placed to explain how the Lebanese oligarchy operates, and how or if the October 17th revolution has threatened it. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes and on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes, and you can also support it on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links to which are in the description. Thank you for your time.
Julia Choucair Vizoso. I'm here today as editor and translator of The Public Source, which is a new independent bilingual media organization based in Beirut, and that is dedicated to reporting on the socioeconomic and environmental conditions afflicting Lebanon since the end of the civil war. I am currently based in Madrid in Spain, and I will soon be teaching political science here, which is a discipline I am academically trained in. And I'm also a fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative in Paris, helping work on the new program for sustainable and inclusive environmental policy.
Awesome. Thanks for having this conversation with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, hopefully by the end of this episode, listeners will have kind of a decent idea of how oligarchy or the oligarchical system in Lebanon works, and how it intersects with the media system in Lebanon. So obviously that's a very, very big ask, and I think it will be unrealistic to expect that we will have a perfect, 100% detailed understanding by the end of it. But let's consider this basically a general introduction, I think, would be a decent objective. So in your two-part series on The Public Source, which is on the Lebanese oligarchy, you first explore the meaning of an oligarchy in part 1, and then in part 2 you explore its particular applications to the Lebanese context. So can you guide us a bit through your arguments? Like, what is an oligarchy, and how do these oligarchs in Lebanon get and maintain their power and wealth?
So just for some background, the piece was motivated by something I was observing in public discussions in Lebanon a few weeks after the October uprising, which was this back and forth about whether the word oligarchy, or rather oligarchia in Arabic, should be used to describe Lebanon's system. And we had seen this word on some protest banners, but really it was appearing much more in social media. And I found it interesting that the discussion wasn't focusing so much on what the concept meant, or even if it was, a correct description for the Lebanese system, but rather whether we should be using it at all, because some people were saying it was a foreign concept, others were saying it was an elitist concept, like an academic understanding that, quote, the lay people wouldn't understand. And, I thought it was an interesting example of two things. And one is that I find that often when we use concepts like oligarchy, which at its core is trying to draw attention to material conditions and economic inequality, when we use concepts like that, often we're held to a higher standard than when we use concepts that don't necessarily talk about material conditions, such as democracy, which is also, quote unquote, a foreign concept in that sense to Lebanon, in terms of, not being originally an Arabic word. And so that was one thing. And the other, though, was that, oligarchy itself as a concept has been quite muddled. So also people who say that it's not, perhaps not an apt description can be forgiven because it itself has been muddled in the specialized literature, especially. And so I wanted to do like a two-part series, the first of which would kind of go into this idea of, how do we understand oligarchy today in the social sciences, also while being self-reflective about how we've muddled it over the past century, and then kind of turn to Lebanon. And I also, it can be fun to talk about Lebanon without trying to mention the word sect a single time. And so I was trying to do that. Of course, a lot of criticism can come from that because I do think you naturally miss a lot of nuance. But, so I tried to just talk about oligarchy in this comparative framework, just to put Lebanon in a more, comparative framework, which we also struggle to do sometimes. So having said that, that was a motivation. And so basically, I mostly in part one talk about this one particular book, which is a book written in 2011 by the social scientist, by the political scientist Jeffrey Winters, and the book is called Oligarchy. And the reason I talk about that book is I think it's a critical intervention because what it does is it reminds us of the original intent of the term oligarchy, which was a term that at its core talked about wealth. And that was, of course, a term that Aristotle introduced. And what Winters argues, and I agree with him, is that oligarchy as a term in the last century has been muddled because we started talking about it only as minority rule. So it's often described, in the dictionary, in like Poli-Sci 101, you think of oligarchy, you think minority rule. So rule of the few as opposed to rule by the many. But what does that really mean, rule of the few? Does that mean any system that doesn't have full participation by, population at all times is oligarchy? What does it mean when you say rule of the few versus ruling class, which is another concept we see a lot, or political class, or even elites? So, it doesn't really get us very far when we think about rule of the few. But if you return to what Aristotle was saying, it was that what really distinguishes oligarchy from democracy is not the number of rulers, but the material position. And here, I'll read a quote from Aristotle. For the real difference between democracy and oligarchy is poverty and wealth. Whenever men rule by reason of their wealth, whether they be few or many, that is oligarchy. And where the poor rule, that is democracy. So, Winters builds on these materialist origins of the concept, but his intervention is to really look at the concept of wealth defense. And here it's the idea that what makes people oligarchs and worthy of study as a special set of actors, different from ruling class or different from the idea of elites, is the extreme concentration of one specific power resource, which is wealth. When we think of elites, you can think of a lot of different types of power. They can be symbolic power, charismatic power, political power naturally, but religious power. But wealth is a very specific power resource, and that is what defines oligarchs. And oligarchs are actors who have a lot of, massive concentrations of wealth in a society. And they can or not be they can be politicians or they can't be politicians. I mean, that's not part of the term. Of course, a politician is an oligarch when they personally hold and have a lot of material power. But an oligarch is an oligarch even if they don't govern personally. And then if we think about that, if that's what oligarchs are, then oligarchy as a system is the politics by which people who have extreme amounts of power defend their wealth. So oligarchy is not a system of government. It's not a particular method of rule. It's a material project which is rooted in this idea that wealth must be defended from, being redistributed essentially. And when you think about it that way, you end up with an interesting way of dividing societies based on the type of wealth defense project that they happen to be subsumed in at any given time. And in the book, Winters goes on to talk about 4 particular typologies. I'm not sure it's necessary to get into them all right now. We can just get into the Lebanese case, but essentially what differentiates them is two kind of types of questions. One is whether are these oligarchs who are having to defend their wealth, which, by the way, defending your wealth is always a coercive project. There has to be the threat of coercion. Otherwise, you cannot hold on to your wealth. And so do these oligarchs, they themselves hold that coercive power, or do they rely on the state to do it for them? That's one. And then the second one is there a single individual oligarch that kind of dominates, or do you have multiple players who are working more or less in harmony? And so that's what ends up, giving you a typology of different types of oligarchies, which I go into a little bit in the first piece, but then, in the second piece, really talk about Lebanon.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with these episodes on Lebanon especially, excuse me, is to try and assess, in a sense, where are we today? So more or less 6 months since the start of the uprising, and the different effects that it must have had on different issues related to Lebanon. Some might say, well, it has failed on some things, it has succeeded on some things, and for me, it's much more interesting to just see how the changes that have occurred so far have occurred and what might be lacking, in a sense, for more change to happen in the future. So on that note, is it fair to say, or let me ask it this way, could we say that the October uprising in Lebanon posed or continues to pose a threat to this oligarchic system? And does that question even make sense? And if the answer is yes, like how, and if not, why not?
Yeah, so I think the question definitely makes sense because I think I believe Lebanon is a ruling oligarchy, which is one of the types. And I believe that many of the protesters' demands articulated in October and since have really struck at the heart of oligarchy. What I mean by that is many of the protesters are making demands about the redistribution of wealth in society in Lebanon, about the impossible socioeconomic stratification that they've been subjected to. And so that at the heart of it strikes at oligarchy and at the project by Lebanese oligarchs to defend their wealth. However, not everybody in the uprisings, and not all the protesters have voiced these demands in these ways. So we also have, as with all popular struggles, there is a dissonance of demands. There are many, and you definitely, I'm very much simplifying here. But you can find a line of thinking that I would call like a civic demand or a political reformist demand, which is, many are prioritizing the idea that what we need in Lebanon is a more open political system, such as a new electoral law, more civil liberties, more citizenship rights, especially, for women, for refugees, an independent judiciary, freer elections. These are all very, very worthy causes that would necessarily make life better for Lebanese citizens. Some are even calling for an abolition of political sectarianism altogether, which is obviously a very, important fundamental demand. But what I was arguing in the piece is all of these could still happen, and we would still not make a dent in socioeconomic stratification. So all of these could happen, and we would still be an oligarchy in Lebanon. And the reason I say that is because if we look around the world, we find that democracies, and here I mean democracies the way we understand it today, which is, regular free elections, not democracy the way Aristotle thought of it, which is, explicitly different from oligarchy. If we look at democracy how we understand it today, most of them are captured and dominated by oligarchs. So what many mainstream social scientists believe today is that democracies have not made a dent in social inequality. In fact, we are now more unequal as human systems, more unequal than we have ever been. And so there's no inherent conflict between oligarchy as concentrated, extreme concentrated wealth and democracy. And so if we understand that, if we understand the place we are sort of historically as well as comparatively for Lebanon, we have to understand that we could potentially secure all these positive changes I talked about in terms of political reform and still be an oligarchy. And so the only way that we threaten oligarchy is if we disperse wealth, right? I mean, just by definition. And I think a lot of protesters understand that. But I think sometimes the tension there can be is that how do we do that, right? And something else that history teaches us is, wealth dispersion has happened in the past, but it's always happened as a consequence of war, as a consequence of conquest, as a consequence of revolution. But it has never been attempted successfully as a democratic decision. So that fact, really should give us all pause when we argue that maybe if we just have a more perfect electoral democracy, we would have better socioeconomic equality. So that I think, is something that I think is necessary for the debate. Again, this is all on the protester side, on the side of the people who are pushing for a change in the system, to understand that if what we're talking about is socioeconomic equality, it's not going to come through these kind of civic-centered demands. On the other side, sort of how the system has responded so far, to the uprisings, I think what we're seeing is, at very best, a shift in the type of oligarchy. And this is something I also get into in that second part of the piece, is, Lebanon has been a ruling oligarchy since its founding, really. But more and more, and what I mean by that is it's a system in which oligarchs are directly engaged in governing. So political office is peppered with oligarchs. There are 8 political families who control 32% of the commercial banking sector's assets. So, very concentrated wealth among political families. They also choose to govern. They choose to govern directly. They primarily rely on their material power for patronage networks. And once they're in power, they obviously use that power to keep enhancing their wealth. So it's kind of like a vicious circle. But something that we have been seeing, not just since the uprisings, but particularly since the uprisings, is maybe Lebanon is shifting a bit to this idea of a civil oligarchy. And a civil oligarchy is one where, oligarchs can increasingly rely on the state's coercive apparatus to defend the wealth stratification. So, oligarchs in Lebanon have their own private militias, private armies, private guards. They defend their own property privately. They defend public space that's not theirs with their private coercive means. But we also have been seeing that more and more the military is willing to defend wealth stratification in Lebanon. So, on the nights where we were witnessing the extreme violence perpetrated, by the state on the protesters, it's starting to look more like a system where the state services are doing the work of the oligarchs for them. Another way that Lebanon might be becoming more of a civil oligarchy is this, obviously the technocratic government that was put in place. So, in civil oligarchies, oligarchs sometimes realize that they don't need to engage in direct rule, that you can simply use your enormous resources to shape outcomes without being directly, you yourself holding office. And, we're seeing that in Lebanon where you can delegate to your favorite technocrats and then say that you have a technocratic government where every oligarch gets to appoint their technocrats. So so I think that's what we're seeing in Lebanon so far.
The transition. Let's. I think I definitely agree with that. Obviously, that we are transitioning, and some might say even optimistically speaking, we're transitioning into a more like civil-oriented oligarchy or civil oligarchy, as you defined it. Would you say, and let me phrase it this way, would you say that the fact that in the demands of protesters, and as you said, of course, we cannot say that there have been only 5 demands or unified demand. There has definitely been a dissonance and a multiplicity of demands. But the fact that it wasn't as loud, it wasn't necessarily in the majority every day and that kind of thing, isn't part of it the fact that an oligarchy, part of how it maintains itself is by kind of limiting the imaginary of what is possible in the first place. So in the context of Lebanon, we know, well, we're talking about it now, that the oligarchy concentrates such a massive amount of power and wealth. And at the same time, part of its strength is to basically say that you guys, you don't actually have any alternatives. We are the best you got. So let's work together, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. I mean, something that we see in civil oligarchies around the world, which again, I don't think moving from a ruling oligarchy to a civil oligarchy is in any ways an optimistic thing. In fact, I think, no, I really don't. I think maybe the civil term can denote that, but actually civil oligarchies are some of the most dangerous because they're the most stable and the most obfuscating. So the point you were just making about how, rhetoric is used, that is used very successfully in civil oligarchies because in civil oligarchies, oligarchs also control media and they control public discourse in a way that is maybe less obvious than in ruling oligarchies, but is still very pernicious. So, for example, I mean, the case of the United States is a very good one, where the most media that most people consume are owned by these conglomerate groups that really, as you said, constrain the imagination of what is possible, and it is a continuous project of saying, in the case of the U.S., now we focus a lot on obviously Republicans and Trump, but actually, the Democratic Party and like Hillary Clinton herself ran on a platform of this is as good as it gets. There is no option, there is no alternative. And now in Lebanon, like all elites who are trying to stay in power, it's the same type of discourse. It's that this is as good as it gets, and we have no alternatives. I mean, that is a constant project of limiting the imagination. So I completely agree with you.
So speaking of the media, it's in Lebanon, it's definitely intimately tied to this oligarchical class. But for those who don't know, can you kind of give an overview of maybe the main stations and their relationships to the sectarian parties, or more broadly, how these systems have come to dominate Lebanese life, especially in the post-war era, like now 3 decades?
Sure. So I should start by saying that I myself don't work on media or like media studies or communications. And, there are many people who work on this much better, but I can give like a very broad sort of overview and also refer anyone listening to the Media Ownership Monitor in Lebanon, which is this project by Reporters Without Borders and the Samir Asir Foundation. And it's the most comprehensive data project I have seen on the players involved in the media landscape in Lebanon, because it tries to kind of render visible the underlying interest structures and connections. And so, based on that report, I can just give a bit of a summary. So they analyzed 37 outlets, which have the largest audience share in Lebanon, and this was in 2018, and they found that 80% of these outlets, so 29 out of the 37, are either directly controlled by the state or by former members or current members of parliament or the executive or by political parties. And 12 of the most famous, or rather infamous, family dynasties control about half of these. And 5 of these families are represented in more than one media sector, so across formats, TV, radio, etc. And something I found interesting is, these reports have been done for a number of countries. At the time, they had been done for 16, and Lebanon, of 16 countries, had the highest rate of political affiliation of media. These included countries like Albania, Brazil, Cambodia, Colombia, Ghana, Mexico, Mongolia, Peru, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Tunisia, Turkey, and Ukraine. So, Lebanon, highest rate of political affiliation in the media. these politically affiliated outlets account for the entirety of TV viewership. So if you're watching TV in Lebanon today, you're watching a politically affiliated channel.
Yeah, there's no alternative.
94% of print readership, which is enormously high, and I guess the most independent, I guess, of formats is radio. But even there, it's 80% of radio listeners will be listening to a channel that is either belongs to a political party or to a family who is a dynastic political family. Something else, though, to mention about Lebanon is, this report was done in 2018, and since then the media landscape has significantly, been hit by a drain of funds. There's a mix of reasons. Obviously, some are specific to Lebanon, bad investment decisions by these dynastic families, or more broadly, the financial crisis. Some are about the region. There's more funding going to satellite stations in the Gulf, as has been happening for the last 15 years or so. But then also there's a generalized crisis for media around the world, because we know that advertisers have moved to other platforms for advertising, and we know that readers don't want to pay for content when so much content is available. So there's a generalized crisis, and so since 2018, Lebanon has also been facing that. I did want to say just one particular, notable example is the case of, the Hariri's family's media ownership, and they which was the one family with major shares in all four media sectors, the only family that really had major shares in all format: print, online, radio, and TV, and they have shut down most of their, if not all, of their media production, and they have yet to pay their employees for past work. And it was interesting that just last week, I think, in the middle of the Corona lockdown, former employees were protesting in front of Future TV for their owed salaries. Anyway, so this all goes to show that this market, which is obviously not independent at all, given what I've said, is also in itself not sustainable.
Yeah, that's a very good summary. Thanks. So to segue from that to your own work at the Public Source. The Public Source was launched a few months ago. When did it launch exactly?
So the Public Source launched exactly around, in terms of going live online, was around the protests. So I believe 2 weeks after the protest started, because it was originally conceived as a platform for in-depth, long-form journalism, accountability journalism, that would be focusing on the material effects of all these hegemonic systems in Lebanon. And with the start of the uprisings, we decided to pivot a little and change the publishing date, precipitate it, and launch with these dispatches, which were not long-form investigative journalistic pieces, but rather these insider observations that were analytical but also experiential, to try to convey the spirit of the day. And so we opened it up to workers, organizers, activists, agitators, students, intellectuals, academics, artists, anybody who wanted to share ideas and collect and their collective experiences at this critical moment. So we launched with the dispatches, which we're still continuing, which are mostly in written form, but we're also starting to experiment with sound work and some video production. We're still working on the original platform, which is to have this long form journalist. Investigative journalism, which are called the Chronicles of the Crisis, and those will be launching hopefully very, very soon. And there's other parts of the platform as well. We're now doing Comic Turn, which is politically charged comics. We're trying to feature different comic artists, struggling and emerging comic creators. And we also have another platform which is for whistleblowing, called Serreb Ya Shabi, which is a platform hosting secure and anonymous communication channels to try to encourage people to whistleblow. So that's where the plans are now. But in terms of the general kind of drive for the Public Source is that we were really thirsty for a different type of media in Lebanon, and we were for, daring to hope that there can be another way of doing media in Lebanon, one that's loyal only to editorial independence and that is not, afraid of exposing power and that can focus unapologetically on processes that have enriched the few and dispossessed the majority. So we really, have a clear editorial line, I would say, in terms of the topics that we cover. And we thought that was sorely missing in Lebanon at this time.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who is on the consuming end of this, I can, say that. I mean, we have seen a few pop up, especially after 2015. Megaphone, I guess, is the best example of that. But yeah, it is definitely true that there is a very obvious lack. I mean, the numbers that you cited are of how the percentage, how much the oligarchs actually control. These numbers speak for themselves. So I do honestly think that the reason why I wanted to have this episode is to have the overview that we've just had, and I really thank you a lot for this, and at the same time to essentially urge folks to actually check the website. Like that's a very long way of encouraging people to do it, and I would say so as someone who grew up in post-war Lebanon, born in '91. Basically, the entire post-war era is my life essentially, and we just got used to, as you said, we just got completely used to not expecting that anything like this can even be possible through, among other things, this whole constraint of the imaginary that we mentioned before, to the point where, as an undergrad student at the UB, it was even more common among us fellow students to talk about what's happening outside of Lebanon, really anywhere, pick your country, because we would have more information on what's happening there than we would have in Lebanon due to this concentration of media and wealth that we just mentioned. So like maybe on a closing note or ish, depending on how we take this, like what oligarchy ultimately comes down to is power. I guess that's a very a simple way of summarizing it. But can you expand a bit on what are some ways maybe that power can become more visible? So so what I'm trying to ask is, part of how these big families control this much wealth is that they don't necessarily flaunt it that much. It's not out in the open all the time. Most people have some vague ideas. They know who the rich people are, but it's not like in their face all the time. There's kind of this the way to turn it in. It's kind of like that. What's the name of that children's story? Like The Emperor's New Clothes, and and so as protesters, as media workers, as leftists, progressives, etc., anyone who just wants things to change for the better, how can media, or maybe you can use the public source specifically if you feel more comfortable, how can the public source help, to use the metaphor of the emperor's new clothes, make this wealth more naked for everyone to see?
That's exactly the purpose of why the public source was originally conceived, is that, look, we all have a sense that we're being, but we're all being screwed, right, by these political families. Like, we all have a sense of that. That was the driving reason for the creation of the public source, is to uncover how oligarchic power affects our day-to-day, affects our health, affects our, the air we breathe, affects the price of the medicine that we pay for. I mean, really the most basic daily struggles of Lebanese citizens and non-Lebanese, anyone who resides in Lebanon. And I think one way to do that is through investigative journalism, through serious, unabashed, unafraid journalism. However, I will also say that, information is one side of the coin. So more information is one side of the coin. But to go back to your point about the imagination, I think that is the other side. I think, just knowing how bad things are doesn't, it gives us a lot of anger and it motivates us. But we also need to be able to imagine what things could be. And that is what we're also hoping to do in the public source through these, more creative outlets, and to, imagine, how things could be different, and also doing, not just theoretically, but also through doing. So Something else that the public source is, which I haven't discussed so far, is that it's an experiment with a different way of working together as journalists, as scholars, as translators, as creators. And so right now, we're bound by principles of non-hierarchy. There's no CEO, there's no boss, so to speak. It's collectively owned. It's a mutual aid network. And, we're very committed to non-alienation in our labor. We all come from, so we're a diverse group of people, journalists, as I said, scholars, translators, we have all been burned by our respective institutional affiliations. So we're all trying to find a way of working together that might be different. This is very difficult, of course. That's why it's an experiment. But it's one that I think is it's beyond journalism. I think it's one that is afflicting anybody trying to make a project that they believe in, that they can also make a living out of. But so that's also part of the mission.
Yeah. Well, on that note, is there anything that you feel that we could have touched upon, but I forgot to ask, or we didn't really have the time to do so?
No, I think that was great.
Awesome. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.